Hi everyone, it's Rain. Welcome back to my podcast Under the Lemon Tree. In this episode, I will be breaking down and giving my full review and analysis of House of the Dragon Episode 8, The Lord of the Tides. Once again, I have my notes in front of me, so let's get started. I'm excited to talk about this episode. Just to begin with some general thoughts, just like as I predicted, I would say in the last episode of my podcast, every time a new episode of House of the Dragon has come out, I have said, this is my favorite episode yet, or this is the best episode yet. And that has continued with this episode. It's crazy to think that an episode could even try to compete with or try to top episode 7. But this one was just breathtaking and incredibly, incredibly emotional. I heard people saying on Twitter and online that this was going to be one of the most emotional episodes yet, and they were definitely right. It was a real tearjerker, and I'm really excited to dig into it with you guys. A lot to discuss, so let's just start from the beginning and get started. So we would begin with Rhaenys and Baela in Driftmark, and I thought it was interesting once again that Rhaenys isn't involved in the battle in the Stepstones. I understand why she wouldn't be involved this time around, because she's overseeing Driftmark and seeming to run it in her husband's stead. And, she's also there to raise Baela. But it's interesting, as others have pointed out, that she chose to not be involved in the first battle of the Stepstones. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. I know there was a lot of speculation and talk online about why she wouldn't be involved, because she has a dragon, It seems a little strange that she wasn't. Perhaps, maybe she thought her help wasn't necessary because they had Laenor and his dragon Seasmoke, or I wonder if that's some kind of suggestion that Rhaenys wasn't completely supportive of Corlys fighting in the Stepstones, although I'm not exactly sure why she wouldn't be, especially if it's a battle that was so vital to helping Driftmark maintain its trade routes, and trade routes that are used by Westeros. So I'm not exactly sure why that is, and I don't know if anyone knows exactly why that is. I'm sure there's plenty of speculation. But yeah, once again, she's not involved in the battle. She's running Driftmark, and I do think it's interesting seeing that Rhaenys is running Driftmark and not Vaemond. I do wonder if that's a sign that Corlys has a certain trust in his wife and wants her to run Driftmark over his brother. Like, I wonder if that's designed to be kind of a slight towards Vaemond, because we know that Corlys obviously was very in support of Rhaenys becoming queen, and to this day he is very upset that she wasn't. Although Rhaenys accuses Corlys of not fully being particularly interested in Rhaenys being on the throne, and it being more about Corlys's family and his bloodline being on the throne. So there could be some debate there over exactly what Corlys's intentions are, whether it truly is about he wants his wife on the throne because he believes she's a competent ruler, or if it's more so about his own personal ambitions, or it could be a combination of the two. But I did think it was interesting seeing that Rhaenys is in charge, and I do wonder if Corlys had something to do with that, and if that was a deliberate decision by him to either showcase his support for Rhaenys and showing how much he wants her to be a leader and a ruler the same way he wanted her to be queen. Now he's putting her in charge of Driftmark while he's away. And, or I wonder if it's supposed to be a bit of a slight against Vaemond, showing like, hey, I don't want to put my brother in power. I don't trust him with that power. I want my wife, Rhaenys, to have it. And I do wonder if that's the reason as well that Corlys wants Lucerys to inherit Driftmark, even though he knows that Lucerys isn't actually, a Velaryon. And he explained that in a previous episode, that history doesn't remember blood, it remembers names. Perhaps he thinks that, Rhaenyra and Team Black would see it as a slight if he chose Vaemond as his heir, and would kind of add fuel to the fire of the idea that Rhaenyra's children are bastards, and maybe he just didn't want to make an enemy out of them and wanted to continue that alliance, and that was another reason why he wanted Lucerys. I just seeing this scene, it made me wonder more about the dynamic between Corlys and Vaemond and what Corlys's perceptions of his brother were, and whether he trusted him enough to take the Driftmark throne or not, and if that at all played a part into kind of Corlys's decisions. So that's just a bit of speculation from me. I'd like to hear what you guys think. I also think it's interesting how Vaemond mentions or describes what Corlys is suffering from the wounds that he sustained in battle. He describes it as blood fever. And I thought that was very significant because of the importance of blood and bloodlines in this series. This whole series is about a succession war. And people in the series are constantly concerned about, bloodlines and how people are related and the implications of that as far as succession. And they're interested in legacy and, what names will the people in their bloodline create for themselves and how will they be remembered in history books. So it's interesting seeing that Corlys is suffering from, an illness, a fever in his blood. And I wonder if that's a clever piece of symbolism there, that not all is well in House Velaryon, perhaps because of Vaemond's battle to take the Driftmark throne, perhaps because of the fact that the heir to Driftmark is a bastard. I'm not sure. There's a lot of different ways to interpret that, and I thought that was interesting. That definitely stuck out to me. Perhaps this shows that the Velaryon bloodline is at risk. I thought it was a clever little piece of foreshadowing when Vaemond is talking about how Rhaenyra's children are bastards and they shouldn't be able to inherit the Driftmark throne. And Rhaenys says, be careful, good brother. One could take your words for treason. Which, as we know later, Vaemond will say those exact words. And it is, of course, taken as treason, and he's killed for it. So, clever little foreshadowing there. I loved the way Dragonstone looked in this episode. Just that shot sweeping over the water and up to it. It just looked so grand and so beautiful. And seeing all the, mist and fog around it, it was just so striking and so beautiful. I really liked seeing Jace's, how determined he is to learn High Valyrian, and how he wants to honor the traditions of his ancestors, and how he was working so hard to learn this language that even Rhaenyra was asking him to, take a break. And I think even just that little scene gives us a lot of insight into Jace's character, and, perhaps that he is being raised or has the personality just of a person who would be competent to take the throne. And it's so interesting when we compare Jace to Aegon, Alicent's oldest child, who the Greens want to uphold as the heir over Rhaenyra, who, as I kind of discussed in the last episode, Aegon clearly isn't interested in taking the throne. He's very selfish, and he does not show any kind of interest, any kind of determination. He doesn't really seem to want the throne at all. That was a desire that was pushed on him by his mother and by Otto. So I just love how we have the opportunity to contrast Jace and Aemond, these firstborn sons of Rhaenyra and Alicent, and two potential, people who could be forwarded as being heirs to the throne, and how one, the one who could be considered, the bastard and therefore not, the rightful heir, is actually much more competent for the role, perhaps, and shows an interest in it and shows the capacity to perhaps be a good ruler, whereas the true-born son, Aegon, who the Greens would argue should be the rightful heir, would be a better heir, actually doesn't have the qualities of a potentially good ruler at all. Kind of like how I mentioned in the last episode, how I appreciated the way that Rhaenyra and Aegon's characters were being contrasted to reveal something about Westerosi society and how misogyny was working against Rhaenyra, even though she would be, or has the qualities to potentially be a better ruler, and is shown to have that over Aegon. I thought it was interesting that once again we're seeing that contrast between Jace and Aegon, because I think it similarly exposes the problem with these traditions in Westerosi culture, that while Jace may, allegedly not be considered the rightful heir because, he's allegedly a bastard, while Aegon is, a true-born son, and that's not anything disputed, simply by that tradition in Westerosi society, Aegon would be upheld as the better ruler. Yet we're clearly being shown just how different their characters are and how different they are as people, and how much better suited Jace potentially could be for the role as Aegon. So it reveals how broken this succession tradition in Westeros is, if the traditions of, trueborns over bastards would potentially forward an incompetent ruler like Aegon over a potentially competent ruler like Jace, simply based on tradition. The same way that those traditions would potentially choose Aegon over Rhaenyra, simply on the basis of gender. So I appreciate that a lot, in that connection, just exposing the problem with Westerosi traditions of succession, and revealing in a lot of ways why I think they should be overturned, or challenged, at least. Moving on now to King's Landing. I thought Alicent very much was looking like later seasons Cersei. In the later seasons, we see Cersei wearing these dark dresses, like these dark black dresses with these strong, kind of more masculine shoulders, and, she has her short hair, and I thought Alicent was looking very, very Cersei in that way. She's continuing her Cersei streak in my mind. She has her pinned back hair, and she has this dark green dress with these broad shoulders, and it seemed to me to kind of represent, for Alicent, like restrain and control. In the inside the episode, after this episode, discussed how Alicent has turned to religion as a way to redeem herself after she attacked Rhaenyra in the last episode. And it's interesting just seeing her, her hair is all bound up, and she's bound up in this tight dark dress, and she has this big, Faith of the seven-pointed star around her neck, and she's replaced all of the dragon murals and erotica and everything in the Red Keep with seven-pointed stars and symbols of the Faith of the Seven. It's interesting seeing the kind of control Alicent is exercising in that sense, both, over her own appearance and maybe therefore also in her behavior. She seemed to see in her outburst last episode as a loss of control. Inside the episode, after the last episode, I mentioned how Alicent's a person who has always kind of hidden her emotions, and that was a moment when she didn't, and she couldn't anymore. So it seems almost, her appearance here seems to almost imply to me restraint, and the idea that she's trying to conceal, perhaps, her emotions a bit more, and exercise control over the Red Keep, even in its appearance, and in her own appearance and demeanor. And that definitely relates to what we see her role as being in this episode. Viserys is very ill. He's very out of it when he's hocked up on milk of the poppy. And Alicent and Otto are pretty much running the kingdoms. So it's interesting how we're seeing this Faith of the Seven imagery that presumably Alicent has put in place, and how that can kind of represent the control that she has over the monarchy at this point, because of the way that she is essentially running the kingdoms in all ways except for by name, which again is another thing that makes her kind of like Cersei, because Cersei in many ways was running the kingdoms as well in Game of Thrones. When her sons were kings, she was always the one in the council meetings calling the shots. So there's another, Alicent Cersei kind of similarity. Alicent really showing off her inner Cersei. Another thing that stuck out to me about this small council meeting was a comment that Lord Beesbury made regarding Lucerys' succession to become the Lord of the Tides, and he stated, "Ability does not alter his claim." And he was saying that as a defense to Luke, where people were saying, he's just a child, should he really be in charge of Westeros' biggest fleet? And then Lord Beesbury had this to say, and I thought it was interesting because that reveals, I think, even more explicitly the problem with Westerosi society's succession tradition, in that, this is a society that it's not choosing leaders based on their ability and who would actually be good for the role. It's choosing them based on this idea of bloodlines and succession. It is that very idea that would be used to support Aegon taking the throne over Rhaenyra, simply because of a claim based on the succession tradition of men inheriting over women, despite the fact that, as I discussed in the last episode, it seems that Rhaenyra much more has the qualities to make her a good ruler over Aegon. So I thought it was really interesting that Lord Beesbury, just in this one short line, I feel like really summarized the problem that I see with Westerosi succession traditions. So, moving on to Rhaenyra and Daemon seeing Viserys for the first time in so many years. It was so heartbreaking seeing what kind of state Viserys was in. Even Rhaenyra said that he looked like a different person. And both Rhaenyra and Daemon looked really heartbroken and disturbed seeing him like this. And I was heartbroken seeing him like this. Another thing I thought was interesting, too, about this scene was, at this point in the episode, he says that he is staying out of, issues of succession, and when Rhaenyra and Daemon are trying to talk to him about how the successor to Driftmark is going to be chosen the next day, he says, Alicent and Otto decide on those things, and they're trying to tell him, no, listen to me, they're gonna choose Vaemond, you have to help us. And I thought it was just interesting seeing the contrast in how Viserys is gonna end up changing his mind, how he's not gonna sit back and let Alicent and Otto run the show, at least in this decision. He's gonna stand up for that fateful moment in the throne scene, which we'll get to, and he'll decide to advocate for Rhaenyra and her children. It made me wonder, too, what exactly would lead to Viserys changing his mind and deciding to enter the throne room and defend Rhaenyra and her children and not let it be decided by Alicent and Otto. And I wonder if it was Rhaenyra going to him and kind of pleading with him, please, if you want me to carry the throne, if you want me to carry on and towards this prophecy, the Song of Ice and Fire, if you believe that I'm supposed to take this throne, and my children are, you need to defend me, and I I thought that was a beautiful moment. It felt like we were seeing... I saw glimpses of episode 1 Rhaenyra in this moment. When she was first named heir at the end of the first episode, she looked terrified. That final shot of her looking in the camera, it's like she doesn't know what all she's getting herself into and how this is the beginning of events that are going to lead to war. And I saw that same fear in her in that scene with Viserys, and she's saying, that it's a heavy burden that you've placed on me, and I'm afraid, but if you believe that this prophecy is true, you need to defend me. And I think those words really inspired Viserys. And, those were the same words that were on his mind even in his final moments, which we'll get to that as well, when he was trying to continue this conversation with Rhaenyra and say, I do believe in this prophecy, and you need to be the one that carried a torch. And so it was really interesting and really beautiful seeing how this interaction with his daughter inspired him, really with the last of his strength, to stand up and go into that throne room for one last time to defend his daughter and to do everything he can to do things the way that he sees fit. He didn't want to be so pliable and just willing to be manipulated by Alicent and Otto anymore. He didn't want to let them call the shots anymore. He didn't want to be drugged up by milk of the poppy, because he mentioned the throne room scene, that it affects his mind, and he knows that, and he said, no, I want to keep my mind. And I thought that was really interesting and really, really inspiring, seeing that change in him, right at the end, towards the end of his life. So moving on to the scene with Alicent and Dyana, the thing that was really, made my skin crawl about this moment is just how eerily similar it is to situations like this in the real world. Alicent pays Dyana to stay silent, and she even, threatens her, essentially, into staying silent by saying, hey, oh, I'm your friend, I believe you that this really happened, and, maybe she really does, but then she says, but not everyone else might, people might think you're trying to slander the prince, so you better stay quiet, so she's threatening her in that sense and paying her in order to stay silent. And that just felt very relevant to our modern world, especially in the post-MeToo world that we're living in. So I just wanted to talk a bit more about that. So I found this article published by Time Magazine on November 9th, 2017. It's called, So This Is How Men Like Weinstein Get Away With It for So Long. It's by Belinda Luscombe. And what's interesting is that it discusses this very idea, how having wealth and power is what leads people who commit, these heinous acts of sexual violence against people. It allows them to get away with it. So the first part of this article that I wanted to discuss was when it states that Harvey Weinstein, quote, hired a firm to gather unflattering material on his accusers. He deployed friends in the tabloid media to feed him intelligence and dirt about them. And it describes how, similarly, Bill O'Reilly, who is an American political commentator and journalist who's also mentioned in this article, according to his Wikipedia page, he paid out over $32 million to Liz Weil. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that name incorrectly, for initiating a, quote, non-consensual sexual relationship with her. And it's very interesting seeing how in the cases of these real figures, because they had wealth and because they had the power and the influence to, for example, with Weinstein, as discussed in this article, hiring lawyers and people to dig up dirt on his accusers, or with Bill O'Reilly paying millions of dollars to keep his accusers silent. It's interesting seeing how in House of the Dragon, which of course is a fantasy show taking place in a medieval world, how it's so relevant to our real modern world. Kind of expanding upon that idea, something else that this Time magazine article mentions is, quote, studies have consistently shown that people are much more willing to forgive if they believe their relationship with a transgressor is now or will be valuable to them. And I thought that was significant because it shows that along with the power and the resources to keep to help keep their behavior silent by potentially, threatening accusers, and having the wealth to silence accusers by paying out huge settlements. It shows that people like this can also keep accusers silent because their power may compel a victim to think, if I do stay quiet, perhaps they'll be able to help me. This article goes on to discuss how Weinstein, being such a huge person in the entertainment business, some of his some victims, who accused him, perhaps saw him as a resource to be able to get into the industry, and perhaps they were afraid of being blacklisted if they were to come forward with their stories. And it's heartbreaking to see how power and wealth in the real world allows these people to get away with these things for such a long time. And I felt like we were seeing that ring so true in this scene in House of the Dragon, because along with being paid in a settlement, the wealth of the crown keeping Diana quiet, and it's also fair to say that fear of retribution was keeping Diana quiet. I mean, this is the queen that she was speaking to, and this was something that the prince did to her, and the fact that Alicent was threatening her, saying, if people don't believe you, and they think you're trying to besmirch the prince, something very bad could happen to you, and how that scared Diana into staying quiet. And it's just devastating how just because Aegon is a prince and therefore has the wealth and the power of the crown, him and his family therefore have the ability to pay off his victim and threaten her in order to keep her silent. And it's fascinating and devastating just how eerily similar that is to the real world, just as I discussed with these powerful and wealthy people such as Weinstein or such as O'Reilly, and how they were also able to use their wealth and their power and the resources that they obtained from that in order to similarly keep their victims quiet. So that's something I really appreciate about this show. It speaks so much truth to our real modern world, despite the fact that it is a fictional, medieval world. And it's something that I think keeps shows like this and media like this, really, it shows its importance and its relevance for its ability to speak to our real world and the real issues and situations we see in our world. And while Alicent does seem to feel bad for Diana and feel some sympathy for her, tearing up for her and everything, then again, she does not try to advocate for any sort of formal justice in her defense. I don't know if that says more about Alicent or if that says more just about the culture of Westeros in general and its, misogynistic traditions, or if that just says more about the institution of the crown itself and how willing it is to cover up injustices in order to save face. So I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it definitely was significant to me that when Alicent does reprimand her son Aegon for what he did, which, yes, I'm glad she got angry at him rightfully and reprimanded him, at the same time she was reprimanding him for making his wife and Alicent and the crown look bad from what he did, not because what he did was wrong, which was very striking and very interesting. Again, whether that says something about Alicent or the crown itself or Westerosi culture more broadly, I'm not sure. But it's so, strange seeing how this crime against Diana is almost not seen as a crime against her. It's seen as, like a bad PR move for the crown, almost. So needless to say, I don't feel bad for Aegon anymore. I know in the last episode I talked a lot about feeling some sympathy for him because he was just a kid and was being, neglected and ignored by his father Viserys and seemed to be being, abused by his mother. And it is interesting that we see notes of that in this episode as well. He does tear up and he says that nothing he ever does pleases, his parents. Nothing he ever does will be good enough. And it really struck me when he said, quote, "I did not ask for this," end quote. Because it is true that Aegon never wanted the throne. It was something that was pushed on him by, his mother and his grandfather Otto. They were the people who were telling him, hey, this is your birthright, you're the one that's supposed to be on the throne, and you're the one who needs to take the throne. And I'm not trying to say this to any way, justify the atrocious things that Aegon has done. It just makes me wonder, to what extent is the kind of person that he's become, the faults of his parents and the way that he was raised. And, and how much of it is him. How much of Aegon is him being a product of the environment that he was raised in, as a royal prince, as a product of the crown that can just pay off and threaten people to keep them silent. As someone who was constantly being fed these ideas that he needs to take the throne and your life's in danger, even though the throne is not something he ever wanted. It's something interesting to consider, to what extent Aegon is a product of his circumstances. Again, that doesn't excuse anything horrible that he's done. It's just an interesting conversation to be had, I think. Moving on to the courtyard scene, it seems that the Velaryons really love their grand entrances, which I thought was pretty funny. When Vaemond just busts in and is like, open the gates, and you have all this hoopla of, yeah, I'm here, here's my flags and my sigils, and here I am. And it reminded me a lot of episode 5, the wedding scene, where similarly the Velaryons kind of just busted in the middle of everything, and they're decked out, in their beautiful, expensive gold garments. And I thought it was funny because this scene definitely reminded me of that. The Velaryons love their grand entrances, clearly. Moving on to Rhaenys and Rhaenyra under the weirwood tree. It's always interesting to me seeing the dynamic between these two characters, because clearly they have not been very fond of each other since the very beginning. So I'm always intrigued seeing them again together, because I'm never quite sure on screen exactly what they're going to say to each other or how they're going to react. So I thought it was interesting because it seems like Rhaenyra's offer to Rhaenys aligns pretty closely to what Rhaenys wanted all along. She didn't want Lucerys to inherit Driftmark because she wanted a quote-unquote, true blood Velaryon to take the Driftwood throne, and she wanted to honor Helaena by having the throne pass to Baela. So I think it's interesting because it seems like Rhaenyra's offer is sort of a compromise for that, and gives Rhaenys what she wanted, in a sense, because by having Rhaenyra's children wed Rhaena and Baela, then the successors to Driftmark and the Iron Throne would both be descendants of Laena and be born from Laena's children. So I do wonder if that was part of the reason why Rhaenys changed her mind, because this alliance would kind of give her, in a sense, what she wanted all along. But it is kind of interesting seeing how, right when I thought she was just gonna sway during this scene and agree with Rhaenyra and be like, okay, yeah, let's have this marriage, and I'm with you on that. When she says this seems like a very generous offer or a desperate one, and Rhaenyra says, why does it matter? And Rhaenys says, well, I guess you're right, it doesn't really matter because it'll get the same outcome. And at that point I thought she was really on Rhaenyra's side, then she approaches her kind of menacingly and says, that I must stand alone. It's like she was saying, hey, if tomorrow when this succession is being decided and you're being kicked down, I'm not going to go down with you. I thought it was interesting because seeing kind of the bitterness at the end of this, it made me wonder at first, like, what made Rhaenys change her mind once she was in that throne room. Maybe it's because she saw Rhaenyra in that moment as the winning side, because now Viserys was sitting on the throne, and he wasn't interested in considering Daemon's offer, and he was just like, this offer's already been decided, it's going to Lucerys. I wonder if that's what made Rhaenys change her mind, because she knew what Viserys was going to choose, and perhaps because it's in a sense what she wanted, the descendants, the successors of Driftmark being born from Laena's children. Going back to the moment when Rhaenyra is speaking to her father and begging him to stand up for her if he wants her to take the throne, and asking if the prophecy, the Song of Ice and Fire, is true. It is interesting seeing how I saw a little bit of foreshadowing in this scene where he at first mistakes Rhaenyra for Alicent, which is interesting because in the last scene he does the opposite. He mistakes Alicent for Rhaenyra. So, and I also thought it was a bit sweet when he called Rhaenyra his only child. I think it shows just how deep his love is for her. At the same time, it also shows how his mind is going. He keeps confusing Alicent for Rhaenyra and Rhaenyra for Alicent, and he confuses Rhaenyra for being his only child. Which, yes, it shows his love for Rhaenyra, but it's also kind of sad because it's almost like it more so shows how uninvolved he was in the lives of the children he had with Alicent. We don't see him interact with them very much, and even the small moments we do see them interact, like in last episode where he's just yelling in Aegon's face and is asking Aemond what the truth is. Rhaenyra is clearly his favorite, which it is sad when you think about Alicent's sons, how much they, perhaps, we can speculate what kind of people they would have become if Viserys had been a more involved part of their life. That goes back to what I was talking to earlier, how much are Aegon and perhaps Alicent's other children products of their environment. It does make you wonder. But it also was a sweet moment, showing his deep love for Rhaenyra. And seeing Rhaenyra break down was very emotional as well, because it made me wonder, perhaps she's crying out of fear. She's afraid, of taking the throne and everything that means. Perhaps she's seeing all the tensions in the war that are brewing and how heavy of a burden this is. And I wonder if part of that was fear. But I also wonder if part of her breaking down was at seeing her father that way. No child would want to see their parents in this state. And her and Daemon both looked devastated to see Viserys like this. So I wonder if it was a combination of those things. And, this was a really sweet, really tender, heartbreaking moment between father and daughter. So, moving on to the fateful throne room scene. I love the opening shot of Otto standing menacingly in front of the throne. Very, very effective. It's strange. It looked like it had more swords than before. I don't know if it does, but the throne was looking especially menacing in this episode. And perhaps it is more and more menacing as this civil war grows ever closer, and the threat of how destructive of a war like that could be, all in pursuit of this very, powerful, very dangerous throne. Just like Viserys said in the first episode, the Iron Throne is the most dangerous seat in the realm, and just like Paddy Considine said in the Inside the episode, seeing Viserys's, physical state and how much he's just been broken down, he said that this is what being a king does, seeing the kind of physical and mental toll it has on him. The throne very much is a dangerous thing and a powerful thing, not just for those who threaten it, but even for the people who sit on it, it seems. Now, of course, I have to talk about Viserys' entrance. It was definitely a tearjerker. Again, like I discussed earlier, it's very beautiful seeing that he wanted to use the last of his strength to defend his daughter, and how he was just slowly, painfully making his way across the floor with all the strength he still had, and how they opened those doors and had a grand read of all of his titles, and everyone's faces, they were just stunned. Nobody was expecting this. I wasn't expecting it either. And the music in this scene was just incredible. Really captured the grandness and the beauty. The subtitles described this as dark, triumphant music, and I thought that was really interesting. It was just a very grand, very beautiful, very heartfelt, impactful moment. I also thought it was funny seeing Alicent, Otto, and Vaemond's faces when Viserys walked in, like their faces especially. It seemed like they looked worried. They were like, oh no, we thought this was going to be like a cut and dry issue. Alicent and Otto, obviously we're going to choose Vaemond and that would be that. But now they're like, oh no, now that Viserys has walked in, like the tides have really turned, and this is not going to go the way that they thought it would. So I thought that was funny. I thought it was a really sweet moment seeing Daemon pick up Viserys' crown, put it on his head, help him walk up the steps to the throne after Viserys had told all the other Kingsguard and everyone else trying to help him to not, he let his brother help him. And it was just a beautiful moment between these two brothers. I think it shows just how much they love each other. There have been plenty of moments throughout this series where they've been at each other's throats. And it's beautiful how moments like this, and especially this moment, one of the last moments of the two of them together, seeing just how much they really do love each other and how deep down that love never went away, even with everything that happened between them. And of course, I gotta talk about the moment he beheads Vaemond. I definitely was shocked and stunned by this moment. Again, it's so fun seeing all the characters' faces. Everyone is in shock. And just seeing Daemon being Daemon, challenging Vaemond by saying, say what you want to say so I can kill you, and then he does kill him and says, oh, he can keep his tongue, after King Viserys was like, I'm going to have your tongue for that. It was equally as shocking as it was satisfying. It was so nice seeing, this is Daemon standing up for his lady. This was Viserys also standing up for his daughter. Even seeing the way Rhaenyra's children got upset when Vaemond was saying these things about them and about their mother. It was really sweet, seeing these people come to Rhaenyra's defense. And of course, it was very satisfying just seeing Daemon being Daemon. It's always a fun thing to see. I was a bit confused by Rhaenys' reaction. I guess I wasn't sure what to make of it. She was watching the Silent Sisters care for Vaemond, and, the Maester was saying it's bad luck to look upon death, and Rhaenys seemed to be reflecting on the many deaths in her family of both of her children, presumably, and she said, I don't think the stranger, one of the gods, cares if I look upon the face of death. Enough tragedy has come my way, and I couldn't read her as far as what she might have been thinking, what she might have been feeling watching Vaemond, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. I wonder if she mourns him. Perhaps she did consider him still, a member of her family. She called him good brother and all these things, despite the fact that they obviously were on opposite sides, at least by the end, as far as who they wanted to inherit the Driftwood throne. So it's interesting. I wonder what she was feeling. I wonder, is that a hint that she perhaps feels some kind of resentment against Daemon for killing Vaemond? Does she mourn him? I was left wondering kind of what she was thinking in that moment. I'd like to hear what you guys thought about that. Now, of course, moving on to probably one of my favorite scenes in the episode, just because of how emotional and effective and beautiful it was. The dinner scene, right from the get-go, just the staging, the blocking of this, seeing the physical distance of how far apart Alicent and Rhaenyra were sitting, which, seemed to be symbolic and a physical representation of the emotional distance between them. But it's interesting seeing how they try to steal glances at each other. I think it's a hint at their desire to want to close that distance, which is something I see kind of later on in the episode, or later on in this scene, So Viserys, just gives this really beautiful, really heartfelt speech, and he shows his true face to his family, and he insists that all he really wants is for his family to get along, like Patty Considine said inside the episode. It's like Viserys is saying, why can't they just love each other? And Viserys is talking about how all these faces are faces that he loves so dearly, and as others have said, it's so sweet but also so heartbreaking how this scene and these moments of his family, eating and getting along together, are probably the last memories that Viserys has of his family. This is the last time he sees all of them before he dies. And there's something tragic and heartbreaking and beautiful that this is how he believes he left his family, united and at peace and happy together. And it's like for a moment they were, and for a moment it's as though nothing ill had happened between them, and it was almost as if the war wasn't going to happen. But of course, as we know, it didn't remain that way. But it's beautiful because this shows us almost, what could have been, and the possibility perhaps that there was there for them to be a united, happy family, and what Viserys' wish was for them to be this way. It seemed like Rhaenyra was compelled by her father after he gave this kind of impassioned speech to speak. She immediately stands up and explains how grateful she is to Alicent for her devotion to Viserys. And I thought it was sweet. And, Alicent reciprocated that and stood up and said her own words about Rhaenyra. When she said, she'll make a good queen. I think that especially, really pulled at my heartstrings, because it's just like what Alicent said back in episode 3 when Otto was trying to convince Alicent to manipulate Viserys into declaring her son Aegon to be king. And even Alicent defended Rhaenyra against her father in that moment and said, Rhaenyra, she'll be a good queen. So again, this kind of felt like a hearkening back to that. And it was beautiful. It made it feel like that spark of love and that spark of friendship between Alicent and Rhaenyra, I felt like it was still there. in some sense. You know, their words to each other and the way that they looked at each other when they said these things, it felt very authentic. And it's interesting when you contrast that with the children, you know, who very much didn't seem to mean what they said when they were giving these toasts. You know, when they break out into fighting and into conflict not too long after this. So it feels like Alicent and Rhaenyra still have that love for each other, but, you know, the children don't have that same kind of affection and history that they do. Well, it's heartbreaking to think that all this animosity from these children kind of began because of their parents and because of how their parents were pushing them into this succession war to hold the same kind of animosities that they had. And it's almost as if the adults are being nostalgic and heartfelt and thinking of the past and, oh, maybe we shouldn't fight, but the kids seem all on board with the fighting, which is sad. We got to see some more of that spark between Rhaenyra and Alicent and that feeling that they still have a friendship and a love for each other there when Alicent grabbed Rhaenyra's hand, you know, and asked her to stay in King's Landing. It really pulled on my heartstrings, and I thought it was really sweet. It made me yearn for that really sweet, just wholesome, beautiful friendship we saw them having at the beginning of the series. And I think this shows that they still yearn for that too. And it reminded me a lot of episode 4 when Rhaenyra and Alicent have a heart-to-heart moment where, you know, Alicent explains how lonely she is as the queen, and Rhaenyra kind of grabs her hand and says, you know, I've missed you too. And it's sweet that they have this sort of friendship bonding moment right before, you know, everything kind of goes wrong when after Rhaenyra has her night out with Daemon, and then Alicent confronts her, and that bitterness between them just intensifies. It's interesting how this moment to me kind of harkened back to that. You know, it's another heartfelt, heart-to-heart moment between them that shows the love and the yearning for friendship they still have for each other. But it seems like this, once again, is right before a major piece of conflict that may yet again drive them apart. With the sneak peek we saw for the next episode, where Alicent seemed to misinterpret Viserys' final words. It seems like she's going to be pushing for Aegon to be the king, and now that Viserys is dead, it really seems like the succession war is going to be kicked into high gear, which is sad, and it seems like this is just going to drive Alicent and Rhaenyra apart even more. When it seems like this was such a beautiful moment, you know, and it shows their yearning for them to reunite with each other. So we'll have to see what their interactions are like next episode. Just a bit more on the dinner scene. I thought it was kind of hilarious when Helaena just roasted Aegon and was like, you know, being married isn't so bad. He mostly just ignores you. And then we hear someone chuckle, and it's like, that was for sure Daemon, right? Like, I think that was definitely Daemon who laughed. And going back to the contrast between Jace and Aegon's character, I thought it was interesting, again, to see the contrast between them, with how Jace had the decency to, you know, stand up and raise his glass and say something kind about Aegon immediately after Aegon was just horrible to him and taunting him in front of Baela. And it was nice seeing Jace getting a little bit of revenge, how, you know, right after that he got up and started dancing with his wife, Helaena. So that was another interesting character moment there to show the differences between Jace and Aegon as far as their personalities and perhaps their capacities for being king. So finally, moving on to Viserys' death scene. It is tragic to think that this misunderstanding, you know, Alicent not understanding Viserys' words because he thought he was speaking to Rhaenyra. Again, the moment that I felt like was foreshadowed earlier in the episode when he mistaked Rhaenyra for Alicent. I feel like tragically this kind of just goes to show that even one beautiful night of unity with this family, you know, them eating dinner together and dancing and laughing, it wasn't enough to erase the years of ill feelings and fighting that had been brewing between them for so long, you know, as much as Viserys perhaps wanted it to, and how he wanted to use his last moments to try and unite his family again. As others have kind of jokingly said online, this is why you don't name all your kids Aegon, because it leads to this confusion. But there's just kind of a sad and beautiful tragedy to that, where, of course, it's not just this one misunderstanding that leads to this war that is to come. It's something that's been years in the making. But it is heartbreaking seeing how, Viserys, in his final breath, in his final words, was defending Rhaenyra. And again, I think that shows really his deep love for her, that he really did defend her to his grave, which is so beautiful and devastating, especially seeing how, heard by the wrong ears by Alicent, it's just horribly misinterpreted and leads just to more conflict and chaos, and intensifies this war despite Viserys' intentions. I thought it was also an interesting piece of symbolism that Alicent blows out the candle right before he dies, like his fire is going out, and then we see a shot of his prophetic dagger with the song Ice and Fire on it right after he discussed the prophecy. Just a very symbolic, very tragic, sad, beautiful death scene. According to an article published on vulture.com on August 11th by Roxana Haddadi, Viserys' last words, "my love," were improvised, and he was indeed referring to his late wife, Emma. And I thought that was just so beautiful and fitting last words for this character who, never stopped mourning Emma and seemed to always carry that guilt for her death. One last note I want to make about something mentioned in the Inside the Episode is I really appreciated how Ryan Condal mentioned that Alicent and Rhaenyra never wanted this rivalry, but they were driven there by the patriarchy. And again, I think this is just another example of the tragedy of how Westerosi society is structured and how it was able to, corrupt and ruin this beautiful friendship between Alicent and Rhaenyra, but how they still have the yearning to rekindle it, and how that love for each other is still there. So those were all of my thoughts on House of the Dragon Episode 8, Lord of the Tides. I really hope you guys appreciated it or enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this episode. Very beautiful, very emotional. Definitely made me tear up a couple times, especially on the second watch through. It really got me. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on the episode. Do you agree with my interpretations? Do you have another idea? What did you think? Please leave a like and a comment. You can follow me on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and TikTok, all under at The Spring Dream. And I hope y'all will tune in next week for my episode of House of the Dragon Episode 9. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see y'all next time.